Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to our December 22 Climate Cafe from the ECCC. We are delighted to welcome you here today. We will have an interesting topic as we explore the intersection of art or arts and climate activism. We have some very special guests joining us here today. With our first presentation, Dash Nesbitt, who is a resident of Germany, and he's an Oklahoma voter. He will be providing an overview of what this means and what it can entail and how it has affected his life. Dash is a professional viola player. He plays with a professional orchestra in Germany, and he has been an essential arm of our Environment and Climate Crisis Council. And as a special guest today, we will also have Michelle Dietrich, who is the chair of the Democratic Committee's Environment and Climate Crisis Council. She wears many hats. She is a activist in Michigan, where she resides with environmental organizations. She has been working for decades in all kinds of capacities, working for the environment, working for political causes, working for women's causes, and a celebrated poet. So today we are going to be honored with her readings from some of her poetry, which I'm really excited to hear. I hope that everybody is enjoying the holiday season. If you are celebrating Hanukkah, happy Hanukkah. Tomorrow is the solstice, and we are all looking forward to Christmas and the coming of 2023. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dash, who is now setting up his viola, I believe, and let's hear from him.
So I'm Dash. I am secretary for the ECCC, Environment and Climate Crisis Council for Democrats Abroad. And I will just start off the evening with a little bit of solo Bach. This is the Allemande movement from the first cello suite. So just to start off in a nice way. So that's just a little bit of what I do as an artist, which I've striven in the past to find how can I take what I do, what makes me useful to society, and use it in the arts as a way to help and play a active, positive role in what society is going through with the climate crisis. So that's just a little bit of music to start off the evening. We could start the PowerPoint. Thank you, Angela. I'll just tell a little bit about my background and my story coming to the climate crisis and climate activism from the arts. For a few years ago, I was living in Stockholm, and this is a photograph of me protesting outside of Parliament. The little person down front with the mean mug is Greta Thunberg. And on the side there, I have a symbol, Musicians for Future. I was at one of the climate protests, and I saw signs everywhere with Group X for Future. And there were all kinds of surprising ones. There was, of course, mothers and teachers and doctors and grandmas for future. And I even found one man who was doing bird watchers, fågelskådare for future in Swedish. And I realized there was no musician group. So a friend of mine in the orchestra there in the Swedish Radio Symphony, we founded an organization called Musicians for Future, and there were a few different groups of people around the world who kind of took that mantle, but we tried to do as broad an application of the term Musicians for Future as we possibly could, and we ran a Facebook group with about 1,000 participants actively, excitedly adding what they were doing as musicians for climate activism into this kind of communal space to share and inspire one another. And it was really an amazing time for as long as we were able to keep up the social media work. This was when I realized really how much I respect people who do social media for these organizations. It's a ton of work, and it's never ending. Obviously, you always have to have more and more. But so this was an important moment for me in 2019, being in Stockholm, seeing Greta up close and seeing her influence on the local community was really special. So you can go to the next slide, please. I wanted to do something for the climate, so I started a chamber music series, so small ensembles of quartets and quintets, this kind of thing. And we had concerts in Stockholm. I tried to choose an kind of open, kind of welcoming focus for our concerts, which was Mozart, because the point of the concerts weren't to challenge with contemporary music or anything. It was to bring people into the door to donate money towards climate charities. So this is an image I actually asked my mom to make. This is a drawing my mom created. It's the map of world heating, and she incorporated Mozart's face into the lines of the continents there. So this is a sweet original. I have it on my wall over here. This is Mozart för klimatet, which is Swedish, exactly like a sign, skolstrejk för klimatet. So that was the idea in local Stockholm, to have a kind of something that would ring true with what was going on. So yeah, we had a couple of concert series there, and next slide, please, Angela. On the left is one of our concert flyers. You can see the groups listed for which groups we were collecting money for. I'm not sure how legible it is, but it was obviously Fridays for Future. There was a Swedish organization called Go Climate Neutral, which was a way to kind of help you calculate your carbon footprint and essentially offset your lifestyle to help your consciences. There was also WWF, World Wildlife Fund. We also donated to Extinction Rebellion and the Adaptation Fund, as well as the Clean Air Task Force and the Climate Emergency Fund. I found a list of what were the most effective climate charities available, and this was a lot of those were on that list, as well as some local ones like Go Climate Neutral. So we played a couple of concerts, and immediately the pandemic started. So it was about as far as we got before all concerts got canceled.
That's a multi-year, multi-million-dollar project. We've got to bring it from the west side.
Yeah, so we had a really great time there playing together with colleagues. It was really special. On the right, I did another project called Bach für Klimatet, which I actually was busking on the street playing solo Bach, just like I played for you just now. I created this large roller with a lot of climate information about what 4 degrees of global warming would look like. And I thought long and hard about what kind of message I wanted to share, and I guess that was the one I chose at the time. Although, having read a book on climate, the psychology of climate change, scaring people is not always the most effective way to change minds. But I have to be honest, I only did it a couple of times because I was terribly nervous. Putting yourself out there as an artist for something like activism is really scary, and maybe that's not something maybe that everyone talks about. But putting yourself out there like that was quite terrifying for me. Playing on the street and putting yourself in a position to be yelled at from climate denying crazy people who might come up at any moment. It was a scary thing, but it's something I want to come back to. My time in Stockholm ended, and I moved back to Germany, and I kind of had to reestablish my career, and I had to start doing auditions for jobs and everything. And both of these projects kind of fell to the side while I was reestablishing my working life in a new country. But they're both 2 projects that I really want to come back to. So that's just a little bit about my experiences with climate activism and the arts, and it was extremely meaningful for me to use what I do as an artist towards something that I am obviously very, very passionate about, which is climate activism and trying to make a positive change in the world. Now I'll kind of transition to just talking about the arts in general, and what makes the arts special, and what our other artists have already been doing in this space. So you can go on to the next slide, please. I think I find the arts to be a really interesting space to engage with this subject, because in a way it's kind of a measure of what I have here. It's cultural sophistication. Many societies in the past, ancient societies, are often judged by what kind of art did they have in their cultures, and how prosperous a society is also connected to how much time and space they have in their culture to devote towards art. And it's an interesting kind of barometer of a society. It allows humans to look beyond simple survival needs and just focus on expression, self-expression in ways that they find beautiful and meaningful. Art communicates, it can communicate information, but it's also one of the only things that can communicate emotion. And the space where those 2 connect is a really important space to change minds and make meaningful impressions on the viewer or listener, or however the art medium is communicated. That's a really special space. Of course, it's bigger than language. It's a universal language. Visual arts and music, these are things that you don't need words necessarily to understand a message. And it's always had an important role in political and social movements. I'm sure you can think of many examples from the civil rights era, that music was a huge part of the civil rights era. for example. Yes, so next slide, please. I just want to talk about a couple of interesting organizations. There's a group called Music Declares Emergency, which is really trying specifically to mobilize more like rock music and pop music, pop musicians and rock bands and things. And quite a few big names have signed up on this group. Billie Eilish is a Gen Z superstar, and she's actually very passionately engaging with the climate crisis. She's used her platform to have interviews with Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, for example, on her YouTube channel, and has many passages in her songs that are connecting to the essential dread of the teenager generation, and that what is going to happen when they inherit the world going forward. That pops up in a lot of Gen Z music across many artists, but she's quite remarkable for how open and quite focused on that issue she has been. Tom York of Radiohead is another one who's signed up. There was a huge list on the website for Music Declares Emergency, but I think a lot of them were UK bands, and I'm not cool enough to know about all the hit bands in the UK. Coldplay is actually an interesting one because they are so important as far as just being one of the biggest acts in the world, and they a couple of years ago stopped all of their touring because they wanted to find a way, how can we make their tours more carbon neutral, have less a negative impact on the planet. And they stopped until they could figure out a new dynamic, a new way of organizing all their concerts. And they ended up having really interesting things like a dance floor platform. When fans dance on it, it would power the venue based on all of the weight going up and down from the dancing. The shows relied on solar energy and recycled cooking oils from local restaurants. And the band even created an app to help fans plan low carbon travel to their shows, and offered merchandise discount code for those who chose green journeys. It's actually one of the most important factors in as far as performing arts. One of the biggest ways to lower their carbon footprint is to encourage greener travel methods from the audiences who go to their performances. It's actually surprisingly one of the most important ways that the performing arts can lower their carbon footprint. Another interesting organization, by the way, I should have mentioned, please put any ideas or comments in the chat if you know of anything that you want to share from your own experience with the arts and climate, please share. Another interesting organization is Orchestra des Wandels, which is sort of in the German-speaking world only so far, but it's planning to grow. It's an organization of orchestras who are trying to draw attention and focus onto the climate crisis in their own small niche. I'm a member of this orchestra, Orchestra des Wandels, and my ensemble, the Frankfurt Radio Symphony, is just voted to join. And hopefully it'll have a positive influence. I see it as, whatever small role we have in society, and I know that classical music is a small role in society, you want to play a positive role with whatever platform you have. And I think that's a really great space where they're doing that. Julie's Bicycle is the name of an organization in the UK which runs training programs for artists. I did one of their leadership programs it was about a year and a half ago, and I was in groups with a huge number of interesting artists. Some of them were visual artists, some of them ran museums, some of them, one of them was actually a light designer for live rock shows. And he'd even done stuff for Coldplay. He was kind of working with the top echelon of performing artists, touring bands. But all of these people were trying to figure out, how can we, in our corner of the arts world, improve and make things better and play a smaller role in towards the detriment of our climate. And it was a really interesting program. It's called the Creative Climate Leadership Program. But yeah, there's a lot of organizations out there doing a lot of really great things. So next slide, please. Yeah, now I'd like to just talk about a couple of composers. There have been many composers who've drawn inspiration from climate-related themes. Some examples are, there was an Australian composer who did a musical depiction of a deadly flood in her local area. I found a Norwegian composer, Maja S.K. Ratkja, who wrote a piece called Paragraph 112. This was a commission to commemorate the 200th anniversary of the Norwegian Constitution, and the title of the piece refers to a portion known as the environmental passage. It states that every person has the right to an environment that is conducive to health and to a natural environment whose productivity and diversity are maintained. This is, an example of some of the things that are leading towards court cases where children and young people are suing their governments because they're not providing for a safe future going forward based on the environment. And this composer chose to use a commission about the Constitution more broadly and really focus in on exactly the environmental passage. I thought that was really inspiring. Many people have used the words from Greta Thunberg's speeches, which I've always found quite, her speeches have often brought me to tears. They're very powerful words. And it makes sense that people would want to put them to music. One that might be interesting for you, Dana, the Tapiola Children's Choir in Finland. Someone wrote a piece of music based on the speech for her, and they made a really excellent sort of music video almost, with the choir singing and some images of young people essentially being betrayed by their parents. It's quite an interesting video. Pictured here is an Italian composer named Ludovico Einaudi, who is quite a popular composer. He writes very listenable sort of contemplative piano music. He wrote one piece called Elegy for the Arctic to draw attention to the melting glaciers and rising sea levels, of course, and demand responsive action. In a collaboration with Greenpeace, Einaudi created a floating platform with a grand piano and performed this piece in the Arctic Ocean in front of melting glaciers. It's a pretty amazing act, I would say. I actually I performed a string quartet arrangement of this piece, Elegy for the Arctic, recently in an art museum. And the art museum had an exhibition about ice and about Nordic cultures. And we played directly in front of a photograph series I'll show a little bit later in the presentation by Eliasson. Olafur Eliasson, the Glacier Melt series, and it was quite a powerful thing. Next slide, please. There's been quite a few attempts to incorporate climate data into music, and not all of them are as successful as others, but there was one I found really noteworthy. This was a collaboration between data scientists, composers, plural, developers, and musicians to update Vivaldi's original 1725 composition, The Four Seasons. I'm sure everyone is familiar with The Four Seasons by Vivaldi. The piece was updated for 2050 based on climate data such that there is no meaningful action on climate change. And it's extended from this idea from the present into the future using data from the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project, which had this scenario of no meaningful carbon reduction going up towards 2050, which predicted climate data. And what they ended up creating were scenes from The Four Seasons rescored for every city in the world based on the climate predictions for those cities. So there was a different variation on the four seasons for San Jose, Bremen, Germany, Sydney, Nairobi, Saskatoon, Majuro, Amsterdam, Seoul, Incheon, Cape Town, Sao Paulo, Venice, Male, Caracas, and Panama City. And it's called the Uncertain Four Seasons. Every variation is different. Each one is jarringly altered from the harmony of Vivaldi's original. This project was developed in the lead up to COP26, and orchestras everywhere around the world were encouraged to perform their version for their town in the lead up to that COP. The resulting music is a distortion of the landscape that Vivaldi created and painted in 1725. Vivaldi painted very intricate scenes into the music, for example, flowing creeks and singing birds, a shepherd and his dog, buzzing flies and thunderstorms, drunken dances and hunting parties. All of this was sort of changed and altered in a way to depict the climate crisis and our breaking down climate. Some variations had birds that had fallen silent, and others had storms which were significantly more intense. Others had rivers that had ceased to flow. So this is a very interesting approach towards music and the climate crisis. Next slide, please. And just a little bit about literature. There's lots of novels that are of note. I just chose a couple here. There's a couple of great novels by Richard Powers, Bewilderment and The Overstory. Kim Stanley Robinson has written a very now celebrated novel called The Ministry of the Future, which I know there's some fans in our committee here. There's a book called The Water Knife, which depicts a scenario where water has become a precious non-renewing resource, with creating all kinds of strife and fighting in society. And one last addition there, The Light Pirate, there's just a few suggestions of novels related to the climate crisis. And now might be a good time to turn to Michelle Dietrich, if you're ready. And there. Hello.
Hi there. Thank you so much for the incredible music and for that description of the work that people are doing. The Vivaldi is, it's all fascinating, but I've got to listen to those pieces, working off of Vivaldi, because one of the things I think that art does so well, just as activism does, is to defamiliarize, right? That in poetry we call it ostranение, it's a Russian word, but to undermine the status quo and to make us call it into question. And variations on the themes are a really awesome way to do that. So so I'm really, really excited to be here. Dems Abroad and Dems Abroad ECCC are incredible partners in all the work we're all doing for People, Party, and Planet. And I like during the holiday to get to talk about the arts and activism and climate, my three passions, and to get to share my poetry with you. So I'm reading 3 poems today, and all of them are written about gardens, and they were written 10 years apart. So a poem from really the beginning of my career as a poet, and then from 10 years ago, and a poem that I've really just finished. This first one was the second poem I ever published, and it's about a natural garden. And I'm actually, now I've lost chat. Here we go. I wanted to post a bunch of links that you may want to follow along, but my chat is being really problematic. Let's see. There we go. So in chat, I've put a bunch of links that you may want to look at as I'm reading each poem. They're keyed to each poem. It says which one they relate to. So This one is about a natural garden and celebrates the monarch butterflies that still clustered by the thousands 20 years ago in the eucalyptus trees along the coast of California. Eucalyptus trees, which by the way are imports from Australia. I call them foreign trees in the poem, and celebrated the annual visit that my beloved, my husband and I used to make to witness them so long as we lived in California. And the poem is a pantoum, which means there are lines that repeat, and you'll hear that. Just as natural cycles undisturbed tend to repeat. So it's called Natural Bridges, California. Here in the hushed, expectant air, with a crush of sand and eucalyptus cold beneath our feet, my love and I seek the monarch's return every fall of every year. With sand and eucalyptus cold beneath our feet, and above the ermine weight of butterfly, every fall, every year, downy wing to downy wing, the ermined weight of butterfly cloaks the limbs of foreign trees, the downy wings folded brown as deciduous leaves. They cloak the foreign limbs of foreign trees, the glad flash of orange and white and black stilled as fallen leaves until the monarchs fly away in spring. That glad flash, orange, black, white, they make the pilgrimage to Canada from Monterey. Come spring, each butterfly drawn its certain way, a pilgrim to Canada from Monterey. Is it the warmth of days? Is it the return of angled light that draws the monarchs on their way, that quickens their blood and drives their flight through days of angled light? Or is it something else that rouses them to flight, that quickens the blood and drives it through expanding wings, orchestrates the change here in the hushed, expectant air? So we all know what's happened since then to the monarchs. And I think of that poem as having been written before the exile from Eden, or at least before I knew that we'd been exiled. And I couldn't write that poem today without dealing with, it would be a completely different poem that would necessarily and rightly deal with the really thorny situation that we face and that the danger of the extinction of the monarchs. So the second poem was written 10 years later, and it's set in Michigan, my new home state, and it's about the poisoned garden of my home. So in 2011, as you know, the Fukushima nuclear disaster struck. The cleanup of the 2010 tar sands or bitumen spill from the Enbridge pipeline disaster in Michigan, which contaminated over 40 miles of the Kalamazoo River, was still underway. And I had learned that dioxin from a Dow manufacturing plant had contaminated thousands of square miles of Michigan's most productive farmland, and climate change continued. And so this is a short poem. I wrote a sonnet, a love poem, to my daughter and my beloved Michigan and to our lovely earth. And if you'd like to see as well as hear the poem, the link is in the chat. For my daughter, when I sweat in a Midwest January and wish to God it was a hot flash, but no, it's greenhouse gases. When I read the news, uranium seas rained on by iodine skies. On Sunday drives, we see the Kalamazoo shimmer, spills of bitumen, kills of brown trout, farmhouses where fracking flames flow from kitchen taps. I think of you then, daughter, grown old long after I'm gone. And I wonder what you'll remember. That day last September, cold apples and clear water, the still sweet grass, and the paper plates, the plastic cups, how we threw away the whole green and generous world and left you there. So in the realm of poetry and activism, that poem was originally selected and published as Poem of the Week by Split This Rock, which is America's Organization for Socially Conscious Poetry. And I've linked to that organization in chat. They do amazing work. And then in 2014, the poem was one of 3 selected by 100,000 Poets for Change for its campaign calling for the shutdown of Keystone XL. So it was sent then to President Obama by tens of thousands of poets nationwide. And it keeps coming back. it's been now selected to be part of a song cycle about fracking, with a premiere performance in Toronto sometime in 2023. It's being set to music by composer Frank Horvat and sung by acclaimed Canadian soprano Meredith Hall. And I'm really, really excited about that. So the final poem I finished recently, 10 years after For My Daughter, and it's set in Svalbard. And it is a longer poem in 5 parts. It has 3 types of gardens in it. So I keep coming back to gardens. It begins with the watery garden of the seas there. I think the seas too are a natural garden. Tells of its ravage, and by extension, the ravage and possibly end of the world as we know it, because of our endless quest for energy and for light, through whaling, through coal mining, that, by the way, Norway just extended to continue through 2025 instead of ending in 2022. And explores a vanished garden gone to coal, and ends with a proto-garden. You may have heard of the Svalbard seed vault, sometimes called the Doomsday Vault, of seeds locked behind doors. So the 5 sections are sea, shore, sky, subterranean, and mountain. And I will caution you, the first part confronts unsparingly the horror of how whales were killed. So want to make you aware of that. Svalbard, A Geography of Light, Section 1, Sea. First, the waters, amplitude of wave, unsounded depths, and then the creatures, bowheads spouting twin wings of vapor, beluga herding shoals of scarlet-bellied char, chutter of narwhal, darkened by cloud and bird alone, until the coming of the first ship's shadow. And in the shadow's lee, the seahorse. The seahorse moors in waters so thick with whale, the mate cannot tell where sea leaves off and where shore begins. The captain orders the launch of shallops. It's May 1612, and so it begins. Harpoon, fluke lance, killing iron, decks sheened by blood and oil, the vertebrae crushed, throat chain, head spade, the long spinal cord severed, the long work of cutting the great muscled body from the great brained head, flesh flensed and boiled, stench that spreads for miles. Section 2 moves to the present. Shore. Now, each year, warmer seas and warmer skies. On Svalbard's edge, the freeze-thaw of ice thrusts up 1,000 whaler graves, broken open, exposed to summer's insomniac light. And who among those putting an end to another whale, on seeing the dying breach and rise, the last blow suspended bloody in the air, foresaw his own body on this stony coast, exposed to scientists, tourists, school children, foresaw tangled femurs of men and whales, foresaw these ribs of wrecked vessels, their shared brutal end. 3, sky. The winds too bear our cargo, the invisible from Chernobyl, from Fukushima, from Pittsburgh mercury vapor, from Ontario PCBs, all come to Svalbard, where winds end, cooling, converging, sinking from sky to sea and snow, imperishable poisons, sinking here through Arctic day and Arctic night. The poisons rise again into plankton, cod, ring seal, polar bear, their young born deformed, diseased, living vessels for what we create when we create light. 4, subterranean. For so long, the great forests of fern rested here underground, compressed by silt and stone and eons to rich seams of gleaming coal. It's the old story, men and their machines. The soil broken, methane blasts, outbursts of coal, miners crushed by fall of tunnel roof or rib, a last breath of no air taken by black lungs. Why? For the light, for the neon pizza sign, for the green glow at the dock's end, for shadows banished from under beds, for street lights incandescent against 6 months of dark. the fifth and final section, mountain. Svalbard's Doomsday Vault, the cliffside entrance, a bright veneer of safety glass, fiber optics, airlocked steel, tunneled deep beyond the sea's certain rise, beyond the reach of our discord, our fevers, untempered sky, a million strains of seed, genetic vessels harbored in sandstone against the vanishing, the extinction. And I do not know whether to pray or not for that age far beyond my sight, when the waters, having finished their rising, are at last receding, whether or not to hope that some rough tribe, drawn by what shining remains, might make a way across the healing earth to this new Ararat, to this beacon broken of light. Thank you.
That was really special, Michelle. Thank you so much for joining us to read those 3 poems.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you for listening.
I wondered if I could just ask you a couple questions then about your role as an artist in activism space. I was wondering if there are any artists or artistic works engaging with the climate and environment that have been particularly meaningful and influential for you.
Yeah, I think the work of Rachel Richardson, she's a poet that you should check her out. If you Google her and go to poets.org, or you'll find her work, and she is writing some of the best new poetry on climate that I know of, and she's not afraid to dig into the science, which, as you can tell from my poems, I really appreciate. I think Jane Hirschfield writes a lot of incredible socially conscious and environmentally conscious poetry that I engage with a lot. And I always go back to Wendell Berry, who's been, doing this work for a very, very long time. Yeah, I read him every year around this time. So, and I really recommend going to Split This Rock. I think it's .org, maybe it's .com. I put that link in chat because one of the things that's really cool about that website is that they tag all the poems they publish. And so there's an index. So if you're looking for a poem or quote from a poem that you want to include in like remarks or use for social media, because yes, social media is really hard and really creative and does a lot of the same things that poetry does, in my opinion. Defamiliarizes, makes us aware, wakes us up. That's a good place to search for things.
Excellent tips there. I think I'll be pulling those out when the recording comes through of this meeting. I was thinking about how you are so engaged with political activism now as you're in your role as the DNC ECCC chair. I was wondering, did you see your voice as a poet as your most important tool for change prior to becoming politically active?
I've always felt drawn to writing. I mean, I was the kid at summer camp who sat around the fire and kept everyone too late telling stories. And yes, I felt and feel that, honestly, if we lived in a different world where we weren't facing the end of the world as we know it, that would be my primary focus. Though I'd still be out there, protesting and working for workers' rights and racial justice and gender justice, a lot of things. But I think the balance would be different. But one of the great joys of doing the work I do is that I do get to write lots of speeches. And so, the great speeches use a lot of the same elements as poetry, anaphora, repetition, alliteration. So I let a little my poet self into the work that I do.
I'm sure there's a lot of great opportunities for that, and it comes through in what you do in politics. Just as a final question, do you feel that your voice as a poet has changed as your life led you towards more involvement with environmental activism?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I think those 3 poems kind of show the evolution. First of all, my voice as a poet and as a person has gone from the personal to the global and regional. And I think there's still beauty. You know, Bertolt Brecht, the great German poet, what did he say? He said, will there be still singing in the darkness? Yes, we will sing about the darkness. I got that quote wrong. Of course, it was in German to begin with, but you know, we're singing to some extent and finding hope in the dark, the gathering, descending darkness, and finding the inspiration to go on through the beauty of like your incredible music. But it's not possible or honest anymore to write poems like the first one that I wrote. And in fact, I've been thinking about rewriting it, because even just reading it, I have to frame it like I did, like saying, this isn't true anymore, you know.
Great. I think we should then transfer to a final set of presentation bits from Inge about the visual arts.
We have a question from the audience,
Okay.
from Shannon. Shannon, do you want to ask your question?
From
Or
Sharon.
Sharon, sorry.
Yeah, I could wait till the end if you want to continue, but I can also ask now if you'd like.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, you know, just what Michelle's poetry was bringing up for me is so much of what I'm so sad and frustrated about. And as an artist focusing on climate change for over 20 years, it's like, how do I draw people to me, you know, rather than have people see me and run the other way? And I'm not criticizing any of the work. I'm just saying this has been a challenge for me for more than 20 years to engage people and really get to connect on a heart level with people. So the questions that were coming up for me when I was listening to the poetry, you know, just feeling the urgency of the moment and having felt it for a long time. So what needs to be done at this point, where we are now, when we know that not nearly enough has been done? How do we deal with the politics? How do we draw more people into this effort? And that's what we're trying to do here, I think. How do we gain their trust and effectively counter the disinformation that's been out there for so long now? I know we're not here to discuss this, but those are the questions that are coming up for me. And also, how do we nurture healing in our world? Because where I've come around to is a lot of, you know, we haven't made the progress we need to make. We need a lot of healing. We need a lot of support. We need to maybe explore changing our view of the world and how we fit into it. Thank you.
Michelle, would you like to respond at all?
Oh, I thought we were gonna wait till the end,
yeah.
but I'm happy to, but I want to make sure we get to everyone. So
yeah, there's some really big ideas there. Of course, it's one of those questions. If we could solve it, we'd know what to do. It's one of those big questions.
And it's thorny and difficult as an artist to grapple with all that.
Absolutely. Maybe then we should transfer back to the presentation, Angela, and there's a final section about the visual arts, which is a really important part of the arts world, of course.
Shall I go ahead, Dash, or?
Yeah, yes, if you'd be willing to. Maybe go back one slide, Angela.
One more slide, yeah.
Backwards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There we go. Perfect. Great. I'm Inge Kemtrap. I'm on the steering committee as well for the ECCC here at Democrats Abroad. And I'm also, as it happens in my day job, in the music business, in the sense that I write about classical and jazz music, and I'm a critic. But talking to Dash, who is such a formidable musician, I decided that perhaps I didn't want to touch on the music area as he has that well covered. But he and I spoke a lot about some of the other arts area, and we're so delighted to have Michelle Dietrich on to talk a bit about the written word, which is dear to my heart as well. But we want to talk a little bit about visual arts. And that is something I became very familiar with because I spent about 15 years as a photo editor, working with photographers and commissioning them, and also dealing with a lot of the archived work back in the days when you could actually handle prints and photographs. Now we see it all very quickly on screen, which is glorious, but there was something to be said for handling and seeing these objects of beauty in person. So just like musicians, the artists who are visual artists, they reflect and they record the society around them. And it's something, we are a very visual culture. I think that social media has helped expand that even more, so that, you know, Instagram is a foundation. It's founded on the basis of visual art. Visual artists haven't always chosen their subjects like other performers, but I would say that perhaps more than the performing arts, you are often left with having to, make the beautiful photo of the king or the queen, or do the chapel ceiling, and your options for self-expression are somewhat limited, except in what you choose to depict that standard scene or those standard visuals. Now, in our own era, of course, artists can be more overt about discussing climate change and bringing an awareness of how it's altering life on Earth. And there are the artists, visual artists, who do documentation of what's going on in the environment. There's some pretty extraordinary photographers in particular, but also other artists who are showing just visually, here's how it is, here's what's happened. It's a more confrontational, or can be. And this was something I heard a comment from Dash earlier, that actually showing these things can frighten people because they don't want to sort of deal with the reality of what is happening. So often the artists that can be the most effective take on the subject somewhat obliquely. They're communicating an emotion, but maybe in a sideways way. There was that wonderful word up there about defamiliarization. I love that, because I wanted to highlight a few artists, and I think the first one we're going to look at really does that extremely well. He's also an activist himself, which is something we see more and more of. But then a final note that we'll end on that, talking about how the privileged position of the arts world. Artists, whether visual, whether musical, whatever, can be can become part of maintaining the status quo, not challenging the status quo. And we look at things, and just the beauty becomes more important than the many other nuances that are there. And I think that when people throw tomato soup at Van Gogh's sunflowers and something, they're making that, they're challenging an institution. They're sort of challenging what is seen as a safe, sacred space. We'll talk a little about that and what that means. Next slide, please. So this is a series, it's a little difficult to see, but it's a series by Olafur Eliasson, who is a Danish Icelandic artist. He's become extremely well known since some of his work in the 90s. He did quite an incredible installation at the Tate Modern. A lot of his ideas are he's trying to bring people into the environment. And he's exploring kind of the relationship between humans and the natural world. And he's become more and more concerned about mankind's impact on the climate. And he wants them to have an experience and understand these things. He's very interested in pulling the emotion out of you. And I can tell you that exhibition at the Tate Modern, which was on the weather and took over the interior of the Tate Modern, was one of the most memorable art installations I've ever been to, because he wants us to think and to feel and to understand how our planet's being affected. He also, I guess, is famous for, in 2014, he put 12 blocks of ice weighing altogether 100 tons. He put them in Copenhagen City Square, and he put them in a formation of a clock, And so showing the anticipated countdown humanity faces as temperatures and sea levels rise. But the image we're looking at here is a series he did first in 1999 and then followed up in 2019. He photographed several dozen glaciers in Iceland as part of a project, and then he returned, and you can see it's a little difficult because of the size here, but you can look at this online and you can see them. The photographs are taken from the size, so we can appreciate how monumental they are, and then we can see that they have moved, that the landscape has changed very much as the ice melt. It's dramatic, it's emotional, and very effective. Next slide, please. This is one of the series by Richard Moss, who is an Irish photographer. And he has said the moral imperative to speak about the environment was very strong. If you are a storyteller, I feel that is your duty now. So he has a sense of mission that a lot of other artists across all spectrums share. So the stills here are from a 74-minute film focused on the environmental destruction of the Amazon. He went out into these remote parts of the Amazon, and he actually shows the situation as it is now and as it's changing. And as I'm sure you're reading, it's changing quite dramatically. Some of them show overheads of the forest, and other ones show people felling trees, riding on horseback, images of the Yanomami who live there. And also then a final screen of the forest floor that was shot in this incredible color. It looks like cells through a microscope. So the next slide shows some of the work that he's done. It's extremely vivid, very dramatic. I think he's also done this maybe from a second series he did where he does, what's actually happening at the time and does colorizing. And again, it's very strong and emotive. The third and final artist we wanted to highlight is one who may be more familiar, next slide, named Andy Goldsworthy. And he is well known particularly for his installations. And between, he often uses like stones and built environment and fragments of things, and he often hides his works, which is kind of bizarre, but he also wants them to deteriorate over time. He did something at Stanford University in California where there are these buildings that had fallen down as a result of the 1989 earthquake, and he built that as part of a larger sculpture. So the installation we're looking at shows a little bit like what we saw from Eleazar. He created and relocated 13 massive snowballs from the countryside in Scotland, he is from Scotland, to the London streets in June 2000. And then he added what he called hidden treasures to each snowball, such as twigs, chalk, and stones to remind urbanite audiences of country life. And the idea was to give Londoners an experience of snow in summer, and demonstrates the transformation of snow when exposed to heat. There you are. And he uses temperature in a way that Eleazar does. So again, all three of these artists are there. We were aware, Dash and I, after we discussed this, that the artists we had picked were all white men, and that is obviously a very narrow view of the world. As we were exploring a little further, we also found a useful link, which I've just put in the chat, talking about women who are in the environment art space. But, I think there are a lot of people who are exploring this across the visual arts world, and it's exciting to see. I think the next slide, and we're going to be talking just a bit about climate protests. Dash, do you want to step in on this as well a bit? Yeah, I mean, I'm quite aware of what's going on in the UK. The two people depicted here have just glued themselves to a wall and thrown tomato soup. It's a very famous tomato. It's kind of funny they're throwing tomato soup like never mind, they're throwing tomato soup at Van Gogh, but there is a glass screen here. So actually nothing was damaged, but it created a lot of attention to environmental activism in the UK when this thing was done. And they've certainly done a couple of other events like that. And it gets a lot more attention. I mean, the comment that people who disapprove of this will say, well, what are you doing this? Why don't you go and protest to Parliament? And the answer they say is, we do not get that attention. People are not aware of what's going on. And so they feel that they have to come into the space and do this. But maybe, Dash, you can talk about some of the activism you're aware of.
Sure. So these groups employing this new tactic of essentially attacking art museum spaces very effectively. They're all connected through an organization called the A22 Network. And there's the Just Stop Oil in the UK. Around Europe in several different countries, there's different translations of The Last Generation and Dernière Rénovation in France. Excuse the pronunciation. These are groups who are really taking extreme methods of peaceful protest, let it be known, to take the spotlight and draw attention to the climate crisis in ways that, protesting outside of Parliament has not worked, and this is now something that is drawing attention to the climate crisis, which we need. We know our governments aren't where they need to be yet, so it's a really interesting kind of tactic upgrade that has been happening recently. There's been, as you saw, a couple of really important paintings: Sunflowers by Van Gogh, and Vermeer's The Girl with a Pearl Earring. I believe, didn't someone kind of like smush a cake on the Mona Lisa recently and kind of say it was about the planet? And they weren't connected to one of these organizations, but this is something that's really going around culture presently, internationally. There have been some people who have carefully chosen works of art that have been a little bit more poignant in emphasizing the climate crisis message through the content of the painting chosen. If you go to the next slide, please. This is a painting by Peter Paul Rubens, The Massacre of the Innocents, to draw attention to how the innocent are the ones who will suffer worst, not the generation which is most guilty of the crimes. Activists in, I believe it was Munich, when they glued themselves to the frame of this painting, they announced with alarm blaring that this painting of Herod ordering the murder of all 2-year-old children, part of the Christmas story, as it would be, describes exactly the actions of our governments right now, that declaring the end to future generations. But rather than just all 2-year-olds, as is depicted in the story and the painting, the decisions put an end to all of our futures. Next slide, please. This is an interesting one. This is Cranach, Lucas Cranach the Elder, obviously from the Renaissance. It's a painting called Rest on the Flight to Egypt. When this photo of protesters glued to this frame was posted on social media, they announced with the action that Mary, Joseph, and Jesus were on their way to safe refuge. Humanity finds itself, however, on the fast track to deadly climate catastrophe. Protester X and Y glued themselves to the frame of Cranach's Rest on the Flight to Egypt, for in a world 2 or 4 degrees warmer, there will be no more safe refuge. Next slide, please. Final one I picked out of having a poignant choice of painting. This is Nicolas Poussin's landscape during a thunderstorm with Pyramus and Thisbe, which was chosen because of the subject portrayed in the painting. This painting symbolically stands for the destructive course of our current politics. It shows Pyramus lying on the ground, next to him a sword with which he committed suicide on account of false assumptions. Also, our government, they said, acts on false assumptions, which endangers society. Liquid natural gas terminals in coal mines instead of a speed limit on the Autobahn in Germany and free public transit will lead us into deadly suffering. Here they were referring to their demands on the government to take simple steps towards lowering national climate impacts. This is another characteristic, actually, of these new organizations. They're no longer saying, please end all development of fossil fuel, but they have more pointed, more focused requests of their government, and hopefully that society will require their government to act on simple things, more simple than ending all fossil fuels, but putting a speed limit on the Autobahn and making public transit free. Just an interesting final note, this group of organizations, A22, is highly funded by an organization called the Climate Emergency Fund, which gives money to groups. They apply for funding, and it's required that all groups engage in nonviolent public protest. The main funder of the Climate Emergency Fund is, in fact, Eileen Getty, the granddaughter of the oil tycoon J. Paul Getty, who used his oil fortune, in fact, to start the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. I just thought there was kind of an interesting connection point there across generations of people using the arts to send their message to the world. And with that is the conclusion of our presentation today. So then if anyone has anything they'd like to discuss on the subject, this is an open discussion period at the end of our climate cafes. So
Thank you so much, Dash and Inga and Michelle. This was amazing and so much food for thought. And I'm sure we all have many questions which perhaps cannot be answered in this amount of time and space. But I wanted to just add one area which I think was not addressed, and that of course is film. We just had the extraordinary Christy Cooper and her crew that produced Youth v. Gov, a film about the brave 21 youth activists who brought suit against the US government, as well as a very popular film this past year, Don't Look, was it Leonardo DiCaprio?
Don't Look Up.
Don't Look Up, yes, Don't Look Up. Somehow the mass appeal of film perhaps can reach a broader audience, and people involved in theater and many other types of arts. So this was a fantastic presentation, and I'm sure that, yes, Don't Look Up, David Sirota. If you would like to ask a question to any or all of our presenters, please just unmute or type * hand up or raise your hand, and we will get to you.
There was actually one thing I could mention, and it sort of connects with what Dash was talking about in the end, which is sponsorship of art organizations by the fossil fuel companies. And this has been a point of contention, I think, all over the world. In the UK, the Tate Modern led the way by stopping in 2016 all sponsorship by BP, British Petroleum. And this is being discussed also at the British Museum, which is pretty amazing because they have been getting support for years and years. And I think there are a couple other organizations, including the National Portrait Gallery and a few musical institutions as well, that have severed their links. It's a big step. And, at a time when funding is very tight, for an organization to make that kind of decision is very brave. But, they don't want to be part of greenwashing. They don't want to be part of, what do we call it, arts washing. So that is something that's happening. And I'm sure you've been reading about it wherever you live too.
I just want to say thank you, Inga, for bringing that up. And it's something that, as on my political side, the council, I'm thinking we should amplify that, because as we call for governments to stop, except, giving out fossil fuel subsidies, this is sort of part of that. We're also asking the private sector, and so much of actually climate environmental justice media is actually funded and sponsored by the fossil fuel industry. It is really disturbing to read your climate update sponsored by Exxon. Yeah, so thank you.
Shannon?
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm actually a professor in Canada, although I'm a dual citizen. I'm based in Sudbury, which is 4 hours north of Toronto, and was founded as an extraction lands or city. And so I was going to say also, Edward Bertinsky is a really interesting photographer who, he's done a lot of like satellite images of the mining tailings in Sudbury, but he's also done a whole film called Manufactured Landscapes that looks at, China, the Pearl River Delta, Bangalore, Bangladesh, etc. in India. And he's got a number of exhibitions on the Anthropocene. And I mean, I was also, my university was really instrumental in the regreening of Sudbury. And again, it's actually been a model for other countries like China and Chile, right? About how do you regreen a dead landscape from the smelting that happened here. And our representatives actually from the Living Lakes are actually at the COP right now in Montreal, as an example of this. So I think, yeah, just some reflections on, places where both artists, I guess, or photographers are engaging with these changing landscapes, but also, organizations who've been instrumental in trying to bring back to life the impact of extraction. But I agree actually with the comment Michelle made. I know even like I went to the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and I know several of the endowed chairs are from, BP, not BP, but like Irving, right? Who's like an oil company or gas company in Canada. So I agree. I think that these are conflicts in a way, and who might state, you can't study, you can't do anything on an extraction. So these are issues.
Yeah, I would just thinking about the prairies in Canada and Alberta, these areas that are so connected to extraction and extractive economies. I had a very close friend who was running a music festival in New Orleans, and her family was just devoted climate activists. And the fight for funding in that area in the Gulf Coast, that is all fossil fuel money. Everywhere you can turn to for private funding for arts organizations, all of that is fossil fuel money, and it really put them in an extremely difficult position. And I'm sure it's very similar in Alberta. Regions where the local economy is connected to extraction, that's a hard place to fund the arts in a way that is ethical.
And your home state of Oklahoma.
Oh yeah, I don't even try to do anything there. Yeah, it's a rough. The earthquake capital of the nation from all of the fracking.
Angela, your hand is up.
Okay, first, I just want to say that I really enjoyed the presentation from everyone, and I loved your poems, Michelle. Some people might know that I'm a fan of poetry very much, and I found them very touching. But I have a question on a kind of a different level, and it's for Michelle. You are dealing with our U.S. legislative branch and other government people. Do you think they understand the problem, the severity of the problem?
I think many on the Democratic side do understand the severity of the problem, and not just on the legislative side, but within the DNC. And I think there's been a sea change in that. It's a very apt metaphor, actually. But even over the last 3 or 4 years, when we first established the council in 2019, I had not legislators, but Democratic Party leaders who are people good of heart. I don't mean this the way it could sound, who really were saying to me, look, this isn't that important. There are so many other issues that are more important, and there are so many important issues. But as you know, Angela, because you do, forgive the language, kick-ass social media and comms. Like, thank you. It's all intersectional, right? And social justice, economic justice, racial justice, gender justice, they are all environmental and climate justice issues. And we can't do any of them without also dealing with the climate crisis. So I do think people are getting it. I think the political obstacles are really, really difficult. And we've seen what's been happening in the Senate, right? Does Senator Manchin get it? I don't think so. So I've said, most of our Democrats, but unfortunately some are standing there. And now, you know, with the House being taken, control of the House taken over, I mean, you know, we're going to have climate deniers and disruptors in charge of key committees, and they're talking about shutting down the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. I'm like, right, okay, if we don't talk about it, it'll go away. So yeah, that's my
Yeah.
answer. I really think there's been some of them already did get it clearly, but I just think there's been a huge, I think they all got it, but everyone's getting it now that it's here and we're in the middle of it and there's no time left.
Okay, thank you.
I see Karen has a question she wanted to, a very apropos question she would like to pose.
It's not so much a question as a cat amongst the pigeons, but it's a follow-on from Angela's because, and I'm particularly interested in Michelle living in Michigan. You've got a trifecta up there now, a blue trifecta, and we just south of you in Ohio have a red trifecta. We're not reaching a lot of our voters. You somehow have managed to do that in Michigan. So I guess it's the broader question, the folks who don't get to come to these really interesting discussions, and I quite loved it, but they don't come to this and they don't even watch the really good films online and probably don't see them at the cinema either. How do we get to them? How do we start that healing that Sharon was asking about earlier?
Well, I hope everyone will jump in on this, but so what happened in Michigan really started in 2018. I mean, we had phenomenal voter turnout this time, and especially among youth and environmental voters, voters of color, Black voters in Detroit. But it also started back in 2018 when we passed a ballot initiative that made voting easier, early voting. And who does that matter most to? The voters who are going to have trouble getting to the polls because they're working 3 jobs, or young voters who may lack transportation or have class schedules they can't rearrange, people with disabilities, right? So it's also a matter of justice. But then in 2020, we engaged in transformative redistricting around the census, and that made a huge difference in being able to take back our state legislature. So this was really a long process. And we have incredible on the ground organizing and in our congressional districts and in our county organizations, and the outreach on our campuses to young voters, for whom, as you know, climate is one of the preeminent issues, but also, as we're learning, to rural voters who care about it too, right? And a lot of independents and people in urban areas. We did a lot of outreach around key issues, reproductive justice, climate, et cetera, that I think made a difference. So I think I was going to say silver bullet, but I don't want to use that as a metaphor. No more guns related metaphors, but you know, it's going to be different in every state, but that's the Michigan story. And would love to, you know, one of the things that we do as a climate council is we go around and we do listening sessions, and we on college campuses and in cities and wherever people have us, in part to help make sure people know that they have a voice and a place within the Democratic Party, just like Dems abroad.
And I might add, I know Michelle was very much on the ground all over Michigan, real champion with a different hat for all of these causes. You had a powerful impact on what happened in Michigan. I followed you daily, so thank you for that. It's a real role model for the rest of the states, and what a fantastic result. We still have Bruce in the queue who would like to ask a question, so I'd like to give him the floor. Bruce Murray.
I'm finding myself trying to tie some strings together at this point, and one of them has to do with that intersectionality. Al Gore at the COP27 was suggesting that policy, but also investment capital, mobilizing investment capital, are probably the 2 key tools we have right now. And I want to thank all of the presenters for what they did. And one of the things was that they turned my wheels about how it is that many of the places where the art that you described takes place is a place where also really wealthy and powerful people go, and also engage in philanthropy. And I think at that intersection where there are also climate activists who are encouraging those institutions also to defamiliarize and think about the world in other ways, that is very important. And so I'm really interested too with the prospect of not so much going on at the federal level for the next couple of years, looking to places, state and local, like in Michigan. Minnesota also has a new trifecta, and there's some others where things can really happen during the next couple of years. And how can, in that place where people of all walks of life, but also wealthy and influential people interact, how can that become a place where we're challenged to do things in a different way? That's my question. I'm also going to drop a joke into the chat box. It's unrelated, but it's related because it's a really effective mode of rhetorical art too, and something that can be very effective to defamiliarize. So if you have a chance while you're thinking, also take a look at this joke that's going into the chat box. And I don't want to distract from my question to all of you about how it can be that at the Detroit Symphony Hall or whatever it's called, and at famous art museums, we can engage with people who go there who are wealthy and influential to encourage them to mobilize their investment capital for climate change mitigation, and to influence our politicians to take the right moves in states like Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, and the rest.
So we will have whoever wants to respond to this, or all three of you, and then we are at the top of the hour. So I think we will let our presenters go at this point after that. So thank everybody. And Inga, would you like to respond?
I'll just make a reasonably quick response. So I'd love to hear what Michelle has to say on this topic. To your point about people who fund arts, I mean, art is funded at multiple levels. You know, there are people who just buy tickets. There are people who will donate $15 for this and that can contribute. Just like a political campaign, you sort of have your high level donors and your lower level donors. And I run into these people a lot in my work in London as an arts critic, and they are a varied population, just like any group of well-to-do people. But I think what I have seen is a greater awareness that this is an issue. And I will say, I think part of it is because of the younger generation that is just not taking no for an answer, or let's put this off. These people, who are often my age or older, are looking to their children. And it's really embarrassing. Their children are not going to put up with this. So I guess I hold out a lot of hope for Gen Z, for the younger generation, who is going to prompt these folks to do that. Because, you know, what are their children going to inherit? That is the fundamental question for them. And I think some of them are starting to see that. That said, I would say that the donors you get in the arts world might be sometimes a different group than you might see in other parts of the funding world.
I guess what this made me think of is this organization, Orchestra des Vandals. It's just a group of people in the arts world, in the arts community, just saying, we're going to have this present and part of our identity from now on. This is going to be something that every audience member will encounter. And, you know, sometimes we play concerts. I've played concerts for Angela Merkel several times. Played a concert with Prince William a few years ago. You do encounter really powerful people. I'm sure a lot of the other attendees were very important people, and you know, when this kind of thing is always present and part of what they see when they come into this kind of posh art space, it starts to infiltrate through society and become a part of the zeitgeist. So just whatever we can do in our own niches to keep it present and break the taboo of talking about this issue, it'll eventually get through, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think changing the Weltanschauung, right? The worldview, that making, in fact, concern about climate familiarized in this case, right? So that it is infused throughout everything that we're thinking about and doing is important. And I really had not thought about this question before, and it's a good one. And I'm thinking about sort of pressure points. It might be interesting, and someone may already be doing this, but to think about trying to influence the people who fund the schools of art, you know, who have huge influence over, say, the writers at the Iowa workshop or the University of Michigan's MFA or music program, and see if, you know, to have them ensure that their funding is helping to support people who want to do this work, rather than say the opposite, or a constraining kind of funding like you might get from a fossil fuel or extractive industry based or associated foundation or family. But it's important. I mean, one of the things I'm not really good at is getting to know people with money, and I've been working on it. I think there are a lot of people in tech who are very interested in helping, and I've been trying to have conversations to help them have the right view of the world, which is mine. Just kidding. But to call into question sometimes the very strong tech-centered fixes that they are hoping are going to fix things like carbon sequestration, unproven technologies that, and to think about the technologies we already have. So anyway, thank you for bringing up the question. I'm gonna meditate on this over the holidays.
I think we have all been given so much food for thought. This has been illuminating, inspiring, motivating. I hope everybody has keeps the peace and safety of our planet in their hearts through the holidays, but that you find some light in this dark time of year, and this dark time on our planet. We can find the light, we can spread the light by lighting the next candle and showing the way. This is what the arts do. This is what we as political activists do. Spread the light. So wishing you all happy holidays. Thank you so much for joining us. And we hope that you will continue to visit us at our climate cafes. We will provide this recording, which you can share with your friends. For those who have missed it, I think there was some fantastic content here. So thank you. And for the rest of your day, or good night.